LegalizeFreedom.com. Why are we here? Where do we come from? Where are we going? From the nature of reality to the future of humanity. Beyond politics, poverty and war. LegalizeFreedom.com.
Greetings and welcome once again to LegalizeFreedom.com. I'm your host Greg Moffat, and my guest today is Carl Abrahamsson, who joins us to discuss his book, Occulture, The Unseen Forces That Drive Culture Forward. Art, magic and the occult have been intimately linked since our prehistoric ancestors created the first cave paintings some 50,000 years ago. As civilizations developed, these esoteric forces continued to drive culture forward, both visibly and behind the scenes, from the Hermetic ideas of the Renaissance to the ethereal worlds of 19th century symbolism and the occult interests of the Surrealists. In this deep exploration of occulture, the liminal space where art and magic meet, Carl Abrahamsson reveals the integral role played by magic and occultism in the development of culture throughout history, as well as their relevance to the continuing survival of art and creativity. Blending magical history and esoteric philosophy with his more than 30 years' experience in occult movements, Abrahamsson looks at the phenomena and people who have been seminal in modern esoteric developments, including Carl Jung, Anton LaVey, Aleister Crowley, and Rudolf Steiner. Showing how art and magic were initially one and the same, the author explores the history of magic as a source of genuine counterculture and compares it with our contemporary, soulless, digital monoculture. He reveals how the magic of art can be restored if art is employed as a means rather than an end, if it is intense, emotional, violent and expressive, and offers strategies for creating freely, magically, even spontaneously, with intent unfettered by the whims of trends, a creative practice akin to chaos magic that assists both creators and spectators to live with meaning. He also looks at intuition and creativity as the cornerstones of genuine individuation, explaining how insights and illuminations seldom come in collective forms. Exploring magical philosophy, occult history, the arts, psychology, and the colourful grey areas in between, Abrahamsson reveals the culturally and magically transformative role of art, and the ways the occult continues to transform culture to this day. Hello and welcome, Carl, and thank you so much for joining us today on LegalizeFreedom.com.
Thank you, Greg. Nice to be here.
Today we're going to be talking about a lot of topics that come up in your just published book called Occulture, The Unseen Forces That Drive Culture Forward. Before we get into that, just tell listeners a little bit about your background and your work in general.
Yeah. It's I always get a bit shocked when I get that question because I don't know where to begin. Well, I could begin at the beginning. That's usually a good way to do this. And I've always been, fascinated with these topics, occultism, the human mind, the development of human thought and culture, but in different ways, from what perhaps began as an intellectual interest, then in my teens became more and more experimental. I wanted to see if there was something to this, like all these weird rituals and groups and philosophies that I had so far only read about. And I did, and I found that, some of these things really work. They have an effect on me, and I want to take it further. I want to sort of go deeper or higher and work with this. And that's, in a sense, what I've been doing since, I would say, the mid-80s, when I was almost 20 years old. I've always also been addicted to printed matter, to books and magazines, and I've always had some kind of publishing endeavor going on, whether it's a book publishing company or a fanzine or also record companies, just some kind of entrepreneurish spirit. So along the way, these paths merged, and I became what I called a subcultural entrepreneur or also an occultural entrepreneur, in the sense that I have been involved in this occultural scene, and both from a magical point of view, but also from a cultural point of view. And that's basically the short story. I've been through so many phases and worked with so many different media and expressions, and some of them have been distinctly artistic, some of them have been distinctly magical. So it's sometimes hard to say what's what. It's just like one path, but it does consist of several smaller little paths. And I'm very happy, I have to say. I'm happy that I've been diligent and sort of stuck it out and kept to my thing, because I don't think a book like Occulture could have been written by someone in his or her 20s. I think it's based on the fact that I have experience of many of these things, and I've been doing a lot of studying and a lot of thinking. So, like, the theoretical, speculative parts of the book come from basically my own work, so it feels like a good summing up of perhaps not a life, but of one intellectual strain on my path so far.
Yeah, well, that's the impression I got actually from reading your book, was just exactly how you set it out. And it does resonate with me a great deal, because I think we're of a similar age. And I remember getting, one point in the 1980s, finding a copy of Colin Wilson's book, The Occult, in a second-hand bookstore. It intrigued me because I'd always been interested. Prior to that, I'd been interested in horror films and horror literature, and through that I got interested in magic and the occult, Dennis Wheatley and all that sort of pulp stuff. So Colin Wilson's book I gravitated towards because I thought it was just a book about Satanism or black magic, but that really opened my mind to this idea that the sense that I'd always had anyway, since I could my first thoughts were that the world that we were perceiving with our five senses, that there was something, there's a lot more to it than that. It's just not what it appears to be. And I've always had that sense, and Wilson's book got into a lot of territory and really broadened my thinking along these lines. I will just say that I also, your point about your book is not one that could have been written by someone in their 20s. I actually bought a lot of related books at that time in the 1980s that were over my head. I bought some Aleister Crowley books. I couldn't make head nor tail of them. I bought Eliphas Levi's book, Transcendental Magic, the translation. It was just gibberish as far as I'm concerned. I couldn't understand it. I bought a copy of The Golden Bough. I bought all sorts of books I then subsequently more or less forgot about. Now, in the last 5 years or so, I've bought some of the books mentioned a lot more. I then realized that I already had them. So that was a really interesting thing for me. Like, I ordered a copy of The Golden Bough from Amazon. It was like one penny. And then I realized, I just noticed on the shelf, there was one that I bought in the 90s already there. So that was really interesting to me. So these books came into my life for a reason, but I wasn't quite ready for them, if you see what I mean. So I even bought a copy of Colin Wilson's The Outsider, which I'd never actually read, and then realized I'd also bought one of those in the 80s, but an old hardback one. So, and another similarity, by the way, I've spent over 25 years in publishing, mostly music magazines. So, it could really resonate with, the life that you appear to have had by reading your book.
No, it's been a good one. And I think this also, intersection because, when you're young and again, you come to this experimental phase where you want to try things out. I think that, goes for most people who have that drive. I guess most people just stick to the curiosity. As you say, you buy a lot of occult books, and at that time, that period in your life, you might not get it all. To advanced thinking simply, but you're inspired by it or something like that. But for most people, I think it usually stops there. You move on in life, you move on to a new phase, which has other challenges. But for those who stick with at least trying to implement these thoughts and ideas, I think my experience, not only from myself but from other people in my vicinity, is that some of these things really work, and that of course opens up an entirely new vista where the environment in which you've been brought up, mine was not religious at all, typically Swedish secular, but there the rational or the scientific or empirical could be like another religious imposition in a way, saying that, you can't believe in this because it hasn't been scientifically proven. But then again, you have people like Crowley who tried all along to typically, in a typical 20th century fashion, to impose or integrate a scientific way of thinking. I'm not saying that's the best way, but what I want to come to is the fact that you have to trust your own intuition and create your own kind of pragmatic synthesis. Because if for some reason you are, for instance, not psychotic and you're not on psychedelic drugs, and yet you're going on the bus and you see that this person has a strange bluish taint or whatever, a person that you're looking at, then, the first thing is that you doubt yourself and thinking that, wait, did someone spike me at lunch, or am I psychotic, or is something wrong with my eyesight? But if you just realize that, no, I actually feel fine, I'm just fine, it's just this person has a bluish taint, that's a weird thing, but maybe you just have to accept things like that happening. And I'm just pulling that out of the hat as an example of sometimes when you're involved in the magical process and on the magical path, you experience things that are beyond, explaining or beyond rational explanation. And that's where you're kind of tested. You have to see, do I just repress that, or do I just sort of discard that, or do I integrate it as some kind of possible pragmatic piece of the puzzle? And I'm very happy to say that I did trust myself early on, and I sort of met a lot of interesting people, and I validated them. I valued them very highly for, they were weirdos, they were weird magical people, but they had something to communicate to me, and I made sure that I opened myself up to it. And that, could have been like occult celebrities, but it was also a lot of magical people who did not want any kind of official or visible status at all. So I think that once you're on this path, there's really no turning back, in the sense that you have tasted something that is very well tasting because it's not on the usual menu. And you find out that it can also be very, very nutritious. So you just have to go with that. And I could never, see myself changing now. It's way, way too late. And there's no reason why I should. But for most people who take these first steps, it's, sometimes the weirdness becomes overwhelming. But that's exactly at that point that you have to just stick with it.
I did a show recently with the author Anthony Peake. We discussed his latest book, which examines the life and work of J.B. Priestley, the English author. Mm-hmm. And basically it documents the magical and metaphysical aspects in Priestley's work. And in the book, we find out that Priestley many years ago went on a radio show called Monitor might have been the BBC, I think. And he put out an appeal for people who'd had weird experiences with time slips, mm-hmm. and strange time dilation, other things. The point here being is he received a lot of letters from ordinary people, quote unquote, the sort of girl next door, the guy down the road. And you actually find out that all sorts of people are having strange experiences with space and time and the 3D reality that they're in, but they don't want to tell other people about it in case people think they're going mad. Mm. And I think most people have probably got experiences like this, got to thinking this when you're talking about the person with the blue tinge on the bus, Not very many people would tell other people that something like this happened, because you don't want to say, well, maybe you should go and see the doctor,
Right. No, absolutely. And I think that you're pressing an interesting button here too, is that we are so, we are living in at least two parallel universes. One is the normal, the so-called normal world of convention and upbringing and things like that, a consensus world, and the other one is the totally subjective one. And I'm thinking that, I overhear often people talking about, for instance, astrology and what's going on. I mean, obviously people who are into astrology in a serious way, and they're talking about this very casually. But that's, of course, usually in environments which are super friendly, like at parties, like at people, when you're with people etc. Whereas I don't think they would go to that length of talking to some dramatic astrological development at work, for instance. However, the workplace is filled with exactly the same kind of normal people. There aren't really any normal people. Everyone is weird in their own right. It's just, of course, I'm sure there are some bigots, and usually the bigots you can tell because because they're the loudest and the most, vicious in a way. But I think that human beings, and now I'm sticking to the Western hemisphere, the Western culture hemisphere, are much more open to the weird, the arcane, the psychedelic in a way than they want to or dare to give the impression of. And it's just a kind of a cloaking based on consensus. I wish sometimes that someone would, tear away that veil or that cloak. But then again, I understand why it's there, because if there's no solid foundation, usually the religious argument in terms of Christianity hasn't been the fact that, it's a way to meet Christ, but it's that it keeps some kind of moral fundament together that we can apply, for instance, in warfare, so we don't go completely brutal, or how we behave against each other. But that said, I think that when you scratch the surface, as for instance you do in times of crises, whether it's a crisis for a family or a city or a nation, like war, then that this kind of varnish of society and it disappears quite quickly. And usually that can be a negative thing, again, like warfare, and people become changed and they take liberties that are super criminal just because they can. But at the same time, it's like I don't know, there's more bubbling underneath the surface, and that's always been what this kind of allure, this fascination and glamour of occultism has been about. People want to experience something else. They want to go beyond the pale, beyond the convention, just in order to feel, something beyond the mechanical, causal feelings of everyday life. And I think that's one of the interesting things, and one of the key things, the main things why occultism has been with us in various guises since, this strange expression, time immemorial, since the dawn of time, it's been there. Some longing for a different way of thinking, a longing for a different approach. And I think, it's never going to leave us. It may shapeshift and take on, for instance, another kind of language, but it's always going to be there. We have an inherent need of it, I think.
Well, this is why people subscribe to religions, this idea of wanting to feel something else or feel that there is something else. Mm-hmm. It's why people drink alcohol, take drugs to alter their consciousness. It's why some people do extreme sports just to push them out of that everyday mundane consciousness. And of course, no matter how safe someone tries to live, we're all going to be thrown out of this consciousness at the point of death. And we will know that even though some of us feel that we know now, but everyone will have it confirmed that there is more to the world than meets the eye. And some people might say, oh, well, yeah, but we can't talk to anyone who's actually died. Well, we can.
Yeah, of course we can. People have done it for thousands of years.
But also people have died. The physical body has effectively died and they've come back. And we have near-death experiences, for example. Mm-hmm. But to dive into your book specifically, the subtitle is The Unseen Forces That Drive Culture Forward. And this is the book that spans a great period of time, centuries actually. But a lot of your essays do speak to what's happening today. And we like to think that we're in this. You say that these certain forces, certain dimensions of consciousness and reality have always been with us, but we like to think we're in a hyper-rational age now, and that things are getting less religious and less spiritual and more more concrete, even though cutting-edge physics is telling us the opposite. That's leading people who want everything to be certain, leading them down some very troubling avenues. Yeah. But in the first chapter of your book, Contra means pro, you set out kind of a background, talk about the processes and the cycles that have led us to kind of where we are now, sort of emergence or perhaps re-emergence of certain forces. So perhaps you can just, in order to set the background for the contemporary scene, global scene where we are now and some of the phenomena we're witnessing, perhaps you can just explain what I've mentioned in a little more detail.
Sure. I think that we can look at many things in human culture and see that there is this kind of pendulum movement. It's you could apply a Hegelian, this thing with the thesis and the antithesis, and then comes the synthesis, where the pendulum keeps swinging. Where you can see that very clearly in the political situation today, for instance. With, I think that let's not delve into it, but it's so boring. But Trump, for instance, being a pendulum movement, having to do with the fact that Obama was so radical. It was such a radical shift. And then, of course, the pendulum has to switch back, not to how it was, but even more to that side, so to speak. And that's the thing with when draconian forces throughout human history, basically regardless which kind of culture, but if we stay in a European or at least Western cultural history, if the Catholic Church, sometimes it's been liberal and sometimes it's been, Inquisition driven and very draconian. But that just means that this totally inherent human urge to explore, to be to use ingenuity and inspiration and try out new things and all these inherently human great things and qualities, they then go underground, and they organize underground just like mushrooms or seed, and then they sprout and pop up, and it's a change in the garden. That's just how it works. And I think that I'm not saying that it's a good thing with this extreme pendulum swinging. But sometimes you have this effect, and that's visually or on an ocular level, when something swings so quickly back and forth, it actually looks like the pendulum is still in the middle. And that could be like some kind of, Taoist approach to it, or some kind of, metaphysical approach, saying that, in a crazy world, maybe it's best to just be still in the middle and let all of these things pass, because we can't really stop them. These are movements that are so heavy. And that goes for cultural movements too. When something is bound to happen because the timing is right, then you can't really stop it. On a superficial level, you could say that, a certain trend in pop music can't be stopped because it's just the right thing. It's more than a trend. It's just happening. And the same can go for on a higher or heavier level. That goes for art history too. There are these movements that they just couldn't be stopped. And when Timothy Leary and the rest of his cronies from Harvard University actually consciously leaked LSD out into the subculture, it just couldn't be stopped. Time was right for it. And then we come to the big question here, and that's that nothing happens without a reason. That's, I believe that nothing happens without a reason. And so I think that the human mind, and thereby human culture, we have a need for this kind of occult and occultural and magical approach to life, and we also have a need to create. So when we're in dire times, these expressions will become more loud, they will be stronger, more visible, more audible, and then you go from being underground and you become visible in the overground, or perhaps even in the mainstream. And that's something that what's hidden, what's forbidden, cannot stay like that forever. It will burst out, it will pop up, it will bloom. And when you look at, not just occult history, but history of ideas in general, that seems to be the mechanics of it. So if we are experiencing today a huge interest in the occult, even in, pop culture, which we are, with exhibitions, with mainstream pop culture, dealing with occult themes, magical themes, it's there for a reason. We are experiencing this because I think our need for mythology based in change is so strong, because we are so anxious. We are so filled with anxiety about the chaotic times that we're living in, like, planetary and environmental, political, threat of war, etc. It's just chaos. So of course we have need to vent and to awaken a myth, or several myths, in which our own creativity can help change these things. And again, when these things come up, you can't really stop them. I once made a film with about an American photographer called Charles Gatewood, and I called the film Something Beautiful He Said, because he was talking about the 60s and how he and his images helped the 60s happen. He said that once the toothpaste is out of the tube, you can't put it back. And, that's a humorous and nice image, but I think that's completely true. And I think that's why we're experiencing this massive influx of occulture today.
Yeah, trying to suppress that, and there are certainly forces attempting to do just so, it's really like holding a balloon underwater, for example.
Oh, yeah.
I think if you take dualities, however you want to express this, maybe science and spirituality, an era of myth and magic versus an era of hardcore materialism, I think these things you use the pendulum, and I've used an expression of oscillating, or sometimes they converge. So they're very, very close. Like you said, an era when art and magic were the same thing, an era when science and spirituality were not polar opposites. But then what happens is they gradually begin to diverge away from each other. If you imagine them going along in a straight line and then moving away from each other like a graph, and then over a period of time they start to come together, and then they cross over, and at that point, that crossing point is where the convergence happens, and then they diverge again. And I think the shape of it is a bit like a DNA helix. If you imagine that,
absolutely.
Doing these dualities. And I've actually I didn't plan to throw this in, but I'm reminded that I've done a couple of shows where we talk about events on Earth and human consciousness perhaps being affected by cosmic rays and other particles, and that these changes in culture and society that happen over glacial periods of time are affected by our solar system as it moves around the galaxy.
Of course.
And that, so that's another show in itself. But to go back to my convergence and divergence thing, I think that's perhaps where we have been at a time. I think the maximum separation between some of these dualities is behind us. And I think we may be in an era of convergence. Now, we may not see it in our lifetimes. It might take, 1 million years, but I think we're heading in that direction again. And we now have, people talking about science and sorcery not being effectively one and the same, that there is a science of sorcery as such, or of magic, and that the reductionist tendency, the materialist tendency to dissect and label hasn't really not delivered what we want out of life, out of existence. It's helped us to understand, but we need to move beyond that. That's not all there is. And we're moving back towards a more holistic view of things, a big picture view, long-term view, if you see what I mean. And here we are. I've mentioned quantum physics already. And what's that's telling us about the nature of our reality. So I think we're far from being almost arriving at a lot of the answers about life, the universe, and everything. I think we're very far away, but still we're moving in, I'm going to say the right direction. We're moving in a direction.
Oh, that's for sure. And I think also if we want to, because these, now we're drifting into a sort of old school metaphysics in a way. And I love that kind of speculation, because, I have written about, how I perceive that time is faster, that time is sort of increasing in an exponential rate. And of course that can be simple because we are so fragmented. First of all, with the different clocks that we have, and, when they started measuring the quartz crystal, and, everything is becoming more and more minute, more and more minimal, and, more, distanced from our, visceral or our sensual apprehension of time. But it's not only that, it's also on a cultural level, because since technology, you usually say that it allows us to, but I would say that because it enslaves us in that fashion, and we become more and more fragmented. We have shorter and shorter, not only attention spans, but also shorter, available times to ingest and interpret data. So that said, there are big shifts going on. And you could call it pendulums, you could call it exponential increase in how we perceive time. But it seems to be moving to like a critical point, a critical mass point. And that's the big question. What happens when we reach that thing? On a strictly human individual level, we can say that there's a limit. There's the limit to the capacity of what the human mind can actually handle, whether it's existential things or emotional things, or, we just break down. There's a limit. Like if everybody you knew, for instance, were to die on the same day in different countries and etc., you would probably be very affected by it to the extent that you couldn't probably do anything else but try to figure out what the hell happened. And I feel that, our overall human culture, and that's not in a strictly Western sense, but, the human culture on this planet is on its way, as you say, in a direction, and no single force can control it. It's not a single force's fault. It's not, we can't credit a single force. It's just this strange human interaction dynamic where there are waves. And I like the way you compare that to the DNA thing, because it makes me think of like a sinus wave, which leads us into vibration. And that thing where we can, talk about vibration as some kind of interesting historical, mythological thing with, the harmony of the spheres, stuff like that. But it's also very, very tangible. If we look at, for instance, how shamans, they've created a change in vibration in the sphere, in the room you're in, and that changes your mind. These arcane, old school techniques. They've been known since there were humans around. And the more we have distanced ourselves from that primordial understanding of vibration, the worse things have become. And I again, if we stick with, shall I call it, this empirical, almost sadistical urge to dissect things, we can learn a lot of things, but it's still so abstracted that it cannot be properly applied on any I shouldn't say real levels, because medication, for instance, and microbiology, of course, that will affect us, and nuclear physics does that too. But there's no real tangibility for the basic human life. They are all artificial constructs that carry a lot of negative weight. I mean, a lot of people in the Western sphere are completely addicted to medications to balance other side effects from other medications. So we become enmeshed in a chain of things that we sort of lose sight of what the origins actually were. And I think that, and I hope that not everybody has it like that, but I think a lot of people in the Western sphere, they can relate to that. They are just sort of encapsulated in stressful fragmentations of time, in medication that's good for something, but also bad for something else. So it means you need more medication for that. Basically, the possibility of straight, calm thinking. And I'm not even referring to meditation, but just to think a clear thought about who am I, what am I doing in life, etc., becomes so difficult. And that, when it becomes that difficult, that should signify that the culture as such is, if we stick with psychoanalysis, it's like it's permeated by a death drive rather than a healthy libido to live and to create. And unfortunately, I think we've reached that turning point that we strive to die more than we strive to live as a culture.
Absolutely. I mean, I certainly, there's no shortage of commentators out there not only predicting our imminent demise as a species, but people who want it. People will casually say things today like humanity's a cancer, and I just can't wait until we're all wiped out. Hopefully it'll be Ebola or whatever, bird flu, whatever it happens to be. And they get very excited at the prospect of this, because basically they don't see a future worth imagining. But your point there about thought is really important. I wrote a magazine article about this recently, not specifically about this, but it talks about modern technology and how that's atomizing our brains and really affecting our thinking. And that in itself, not just, thoughts or things, but physically affecting our brains. And that is going to affect our evolution as a species. So I'm of course quite concerned about that. But if we look at time or human, or just Earth, shall we say, Earth, ages that come and go, and if we think of it somewhat cyclic, and if we think about the vibration and the oscillation and the pendulum analogies that we used earlier, we certainly have a lot of myths and stories that seem to suggest that something really, really bad happened a long time ago in the past. Maybe prior to the Ice Age. We know, for example, that, we think we know that there was a meteor strike that hit the Earth and, triggered the die off of the dinosaurs. Though there's some evidence that had already started before the Earth was struck. Then we have myths of Atlantis, for example, and lots of other stories saying that, there was a golden age, there was a great time, and then something terrible happened. We have the myths all over the world of the deluge, including the biblical flood. And there's also a reading of the Bible in the Old Testament that you can, if you interpret it a certain way, that basically says that there was creation, but it became corrupted. It was a bit like a substance in a petri dish in a lab, and it got contaminated. So the scientist, as it were, the creator, threw it out, completely destroyed it, and started again. So that's one reading of the Bible. So, but however, whatever truth there is in any of those myths and legends and ideas and concepts, one thing that we don't appear to have had in the past is the what I referred to a few minutes ago, this age of mass media and communications, which has facilitated a lot of things. We're now speaking, across communication lines that would be unimagined, only a century ago. But there are problems here, and we've alluded to these already. The problem of dumbing down, of diluting, distracting our attention, propaganda. So as much as there are opportunities here in this modern technological milieu, powerful tools can also be deadly weapons.
Oh, absolutely. And I think that it's, again, we can stick with these things from psychoanalysis, libido versus death drive, because with all of these amazing things, and I'm even taking, space travel into account, and even possibly artificial intelligence, which I'm normally sort of critical against, is that these are amazing things. And if we were a life-affirming culture or race or species, then these would all be magnificent things to make all of our lives better now and in the future. But actually what's happening is that faster and faster these things pop up, people don't question anything. If Jeff Bezos says that, the only substantial thing I can do with my wealth, because I'm the richest man in history, is space travel. What kind of an argument is that? He could do so many things with his money to help out people who need help, etc., etc. But it's just the fact that these wealthy people want so bad to go out in space. It's like, it's so infantile. They want to escape the responsibility that perhaps not them as individuals have caused, but this mess that we're in, that humanity as such together have created. It's an escapistic thing. And the same thing with artificial intelligence. Haven't these people read science fiction? Don't they know that science fiction is the basis of creative scientific speculation that eventually leads to the creation and manifestation of the things that exist in science fiction? That is not usually looked upon as a serious argument. But if you look at the development of science fiction, parallel to the development of technology in general, we can see very distinct lines. It comes from science fiction. And if we talk about artificial intelligence, that science fiction is not the happy one. It's the most dystopic and human killing, variant there is. So all of these things that are happening they have the potential to be, mind altering, life changing, great experiences. They're all geared up for absolute destruction. And that's remarkable.
Yes, now it seems that in many ways you talk about this death drive, that's a collective thing, and even though you or I might feel the opposite, nevertheless it's about what's manifesting out there. It kind of reflects the collective consciousness, maybe not 100% of it, in the same way that you can have cells within an organism that are rogue, doing their own, they're doing their own thing, not what the rest of the organism is doing. In your chapter, Pokemon Go Away, we talk about the individual versus the collective, with respect to magical practice, but actually you could apply it to any self-actualization endeavor. And if you want to think of it in religious terms, that individuals, you or I, anyone listening to this, can have direct access to the divine. That's to say, to go your own way, which is exactly how you described your own life. And that our access to the divine doesn't have to be mediated by priesthoods of organized hierarchical religions. And you can apply that just to life. And thinking about the situation that we find ourselves in, I've always been a bit skeptical about collective action in terms of change. And a lot of people think that's the only way to do it, because it has to be the mass. Until we reach a critical point, then nothing changes. But you have this Jungian concept that the individual can only work on themselves as well. That would apply here. And, the phrase, you can help no one else.
Yeah.
But you can drive the collective forward that way. So I'm not trying to say a contradictory thing here. I think collectives are powerless without individuals, and individuals can change the collective. But mass movements like protests, everything from Occupy, 9/11 Truth, 9/11 Truth, the recent Me Too movement, these schemes to quote unquote save the world seem to, whatever they achieve in the eyes of the organizers or those behind it, they seem to cause more schism and separation in the collective consciousness. They don't seem to be positive developments when looked at in the bit wider context.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And I'm thinking that, mass movements are, spontaneous, made possible by social media and immediate access to communications tools and stuff like that. It's essentially a very good thing. But you don't really change things like that, because what will it change that if some movement has a post on some social media and it gets 1 million likes or some kind of 1 million acknowledgements of some kind? What does that change? Well, it changed only on the seed level, or what they call the meme level. Another meme is added to something that might become what I call like a golemic thing inside the human mind, that is kind of a magical egregore that has power beyond the human mind, simply because the human mind is very fertile soil. So in that sense, as a meme factory, social media and movements coming from there can be informing, they can be inspiring, they can be encouraging. But in themselves, they don't change a thing. Changing things, that means that one individual person must change the way he or she perceives the world and acts upon that. Mass movements in terms of non-thinking, I'm thinking of like revolutions. That's usually just like a herd that's driven towards its own death. And then creates usually a much more draconian environment. However, if we want to stick with sort of like Christian influx in as a technique or a method, that can work because, we live in that kind of culture, or maybe it's older than that too. Meaning, when there's some kind of mass movement and the draconian forces create a visible harm to like normal people that the majority of people can relate to, that can change things. That kind of sacrifice that becomes so horrific. There are many examples of that, and in that sense, technology and social media can be a great alleviator or also instigator of change, in the sense that the immediate sharing of images, for instance, of horrible, oppressive things or abuses, that can create an emotional response in the human individual and in many human individuals together. That can actually change things, in the sense that also, people in power, politicians, trendsetters, great journalists, they can write about these things and immediately create a critical mass that again is unstoppable. But on the whole, I see many of these things that have to do with technology and social media. They are considerably more escapisms. And I'm actually working on a piece now that I think will be in the next, next anthology. I don't think it will be called Occulture 2, but anyway, it's that, politics is the opium of the people. Taking Marx one step further, Marx and Engels claim that, religion, that's the opium of the people to keep them down. But no, it's politics. Because the constant engagement in things that are, so easily controlled, so easily provoked, so easily, what's the word? Well, you know what I mean. Is that Donald Trump sends out a tweet and the world goes crazy? Is that really necessary? I don't think so. So in that sense, that kind of two-edged sword possibility of social media specifically and technology in general, it's something to be taken into account when we talk about the dumbing down thing. Because there are, I have a daughter, she's 19, she has never really experienced a life without a cell phone, and she is completely addicted to it. Same thing with internet access. And I'm fine, I can be out in nature. And I don't care about email or Facebook. I'm safe and saved in that way. But for kids today, they are completely addicted, not only to the platforms and the screens, but also to this kind of memetic, meme-based information flow. And that, of course, is created by people who don't really want to enlighten or encourage or illuminate people. They just want to keep them pacified. And a lot of the passivity or pacifying capacity today comes with these, evanescent, ephemeral, super causal, idiotic politics that really says nothing about politics at all. It's just, back and forth, causal, infantile bullshit.
Yeah, well, could give you my take on all that in detail, but I'm just going to put a plug in for my own work, and if folks can get the latest issue of New Dawn magazine.
Mm-hmm.
I've got an article in there called "Is the Internet Killing Your Brain?" And
beautiful.
And
it might be.
That sets it out in detail. But you used the phrase double-edged sword, and that's what we're facing with a lot of issues here, technologically. And another duality is that two ideas we've already touched on is that, myth and fiction precede real development, is actually a quote from your book.
Yes.
And that the space program basically came from science fiction, and there was a lot of amazing things have been achieved. Some people would say, to what end? How has it helped us? But still, in their own right, some really amazing technological feats.
Yeah.
But currently, it's like we seem to be very pessimistic about the future. And of course, myth and fiction, the myth of our time, whatever it is, if it is human extinction, then that precedes real development. So that doesn't sound like a good outcome. But even though we can imagine things, everything that's real begins as a thought. So you could say, well, perhaps we should start imagining a better future. But I find that, as exactly as you said, that the modern myths seem absurd, particularly as the sort of reality on the ground, as it were, seems to go in a different direction. And the modern myths, I'm talking about the techno-utopian stuff, transhumanism, AI, Mars One idea. People have got to look up that Mars One website. It's hysterical. Really, you'd think it was a spoof, but it's completely serious. And, I take a great interest in astronomy. And every time, this is started back in the late 90s, they started saying that they'd found exoplanets elsewhere with potentially Earth-like qualities to them. They announced these discoveries, actually I was going to say every few years, but it seems about every few months now. And people go on the internet as if it's the second coming of Christ.
Yeah.
And they're saying, oh wow, look at this. And they think that the artist's impression or the computer, rendering of what one of these planets might look like is a picture of it. I'm saying, no, this thing is like, a million light years away or something. We cannot see it. Nobody has seen it. And by the way, they announced this 6 months ago.
Yeah.
And you were presumably sending stuff out on Facebook about it then. So it's absolutely infantile. So it is, you can see two sides of the same coin here. One, the individual absolutely has great potential to affect the world around them, to steer the direction of your own life, just to think about it in simple terms.
Yeah.
But when it goes up to a collective level, it just seems to go wrong. What we could draw out from all of that is a central theme of your writing about, in your book, that runs through your different essays, is the idea of taking control of your own life. And if you want to look at it from a magical point of view, then that's an individual pursuit, really. That's the only way to move forward. You can't change the world, but you can change the world in you.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm also a strong believer in, I think that when I started out, I was very, into the occult, and I worked in occult systems and stuff like that. And I carried that kind of tradition onwards, basically the arcane stuff, the old stuff. Then that changed in the sense that I wanted to mix in other things and sort of modernize things, still only for myself. Then I wanted to see if it could have any sort of validity for someone else too, also interested in these things. But the thing is that, how should I put it? Jung and his concept of individuation is probably the one that strikes the greatest resonance with me now, because it's beyond the occult. It's still as deep and, as inclusive of all aspects of the human mind, of human existential issues and emotional issues and physical issues and metaphysical issues. It's just like an overall good term for me to use. And that said, it's not all selfish, because you owe it to yourself, to maximize your own life and, enhance life, etc. But my experience is, even when I was using the occult terminology, is that it's the best you can do for other people.
Yes.
Because that kind of inspiration is the invaluable key to it. You can't tell people to, do this and do that. I mean, many people do and many people listen, but they get nowhere. They just become, a different kind of sheep. But the thing is that when you inspire people to deal with their own lives in their own ways, and also telling them, get your own fucking language, just see what's there for you and make it your own. That's invaluable. And I'm happy to say that I received that in my own, so-called training in a way. It wasn't like I went to Hogwarts, but I met some interesting people and they told me interesting things, but it was never dogmatic. It was never, you have to do this to get this effect. It was always, try it, see if you like it. You can clothe it in different terms. It doesn't matter. The main thing is the integration in my own psyche to see what actually works. It's that kind of pragmatism is invaluable. And you can only, get people to be pragmatically involved with their own destinies if they are inspired to. Motivated to. Motivation and inspiration is key.
Yeah, I think, as you say, taking control of your own life and your own destiny, it can inspire other people to do the same. It doesn't mean that you succeed exactly in everything that you do, but you're pushing in the right direction. And I think that's a key lesson that you draw out in your book. And you'll find this message all over the place. It's not a new one. We talked earlier on about muddy, clouded thought. And people really need to be honest with themselves to be able to look in the mirror and not wince, if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
The way I express it is, I don't have any dark corners in my mind. What I mean by that is not that I never think a dark thought or a negative thought, but I see it for what it is. I recognize it. I don't try and pretend it's something that it's not. I don't have any demons. There's nothing hiding in the depths of my mind that I am consciously aware of, that I'm really sort of ashamed of, or that I want to keep suppressed or anything like that. So know yourself, be honest with yourself, understand your own motivations. A lot of people don't actually know what's driving them. In terms of achieving things, a lot of people don't actually know what they want. They've never actually decided, what do I want? What works for me? What pleases me? And again, it sounds selfish, but it's not about that at all. It's like when you're in an aircraft and it runs into trouble, put your own oxygen mask on before you try and help anyone else. Yeah. That's the thing. So be aware of your own motivations, understand yourself on that level, be aware of the motivations of others as well, and that they may not understand their own motivations. Don't be swayed by opinion, because if you haven't got a plan for yourself, you can be sure that your life is unfolding following someone else's plan, which may not even be conscious in itself. So I think that's step number one, is really shining a light of consciousness on yourself. And of course, you can couch all of this in magical terms as well, if you want to do that.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. And that's this thing with the terminology, is that also something that has been on my mind for the past few years, is that, there can be, negative things with sticking to tradition, sticking to traditional terminology or order system or philosophical tradition or magical tradition, in the sense that it becomes tinged or affected by negative association, simply because it's too obfuscated or complex or unnecessarily unclear. And usually these things come from a time when these things were hidden or forbidden. So you had to have a symbolic system, which was easily transmitted to those, becoming initiated, and you could, use it in art without the authorities, the draconian authorities, realizing what it was. At the same time, I think it's important to constantly keep in mind that there's only one authority to find, and that will be your own. I've noticed in my own, I wouldn't say close circle of friends, but in, people I know who they are, and they're gravitating towards these super arcane power structures, like, for instance, not just Christianity, but Catholicism. And these are Swedish people, Swedish intellectual people who have grown up, secularly, super well educated and successful people. And that makes me question, why do they gravitate towards a power structure that has been so detrimental to human development and so draconian and so violent? And for me, I think I understand it. It has nothing to do with the substance. They say that they're attracted to the ritual, etc. That may be the case. But what it's really about is their vehement denial of assuming their own authority. So what do they look for? Well, they go compensatory, and they want really strong authorities that cannot be questioned. So they go for these power structures. And of course, we can see the same thing with young people, disenfranchised or disgruntled people coming from different cultures, seeking solace in extreme fundamentalist Islam. It's the same thing. They don't want practical solutions on how to make your life better. They want to go head first into a subjugation, into the most draconian, backward striving structures. And I find that a little bit alarming, especially when people who have choices do that.
Yes, and we're sort of moving into an age increasingly, with all the problems that we're seeing manifesting. I think they may be just simply the birth pangs of something that may turn out to be better. But we're certainly in an era when people are looking for answers. Increasingly, the world is confusing and chaotic, as you mentioned.
Yeah.
So, and this is where Donald Trump comes into all this. People are very ready to accept someone who stands up and says, I have the answer, follow me, do this. I can solve the problem, especially if it sounds plausible. But to be honest with you, Trump is evidence that you can now make those sort of claims without having a plan, without knowing what you're going to do. And people will still go for it. So, and I think, we saw that. I mean, that's a lot of how the Nazi party came to power in Germany was through making claims that we have a broken system, we have the answers. And they had the answers up to a point. They had some economic ideas, and we're definitely in that place now. And that's potentially very dangerous because most people don't want to deal with their own problems. They don't want to take responsibility, basically.
Exactly.
They cannot wait to give it away. And there are people there, just waiting to soak it all up.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And again, what kind of culture, what kind of development is that? It's a culture and an overall humanity that basically it's so tired of the chaos that it wants to die, because otherwise it wouldn't be like this. And it's unfortunate because, of course, I think I was born an optimist. So I think that there's absolutely time to change all of these things. But unfortunately, I think it's going to be, force and fire, baptism by fire. Something really, really bad needs to happen before people can wake up. There needs to be a rude awakening. And then, hopefully, all of the, shall we call it, the intellectual infrastructure hasn't been destroyed. That there will still be sources of knowledge, whether they're living or written, printed. And then you can start anew, because I think the critical mass point, we were talking about that before, that as if we're on the way. I think maybe we've even passed it. It's just like things are moving so slowly, yet in fact it's going so fast that we can't even see it.
Oh yeah, but I've heard people sort of still using the term World War III. And I say, look, listen, World War III started years ago.
Yeah. Yeah.
We're right in the middle of it. And it's not, and it looks like it's probably going to get worse before it gets better. So, as you say, people that's not wanting to allow their minds to catch up with where we actually are. People are always making things out to be less bad. For every person, for every doomsayer who's overstating the case, there's a lot of other people who say, oh no, it's going to be fine. It's going to be fine. And when I say that, I mean, we both sound like we're sitting here going, ultimately it's going to be fine. But I'm talking about people who say it's going to be fine and they don't believe it for a second.
Yeah.
They've got no idea how it's going to be fine, how it could possibly be made fine. But, they're superficially telling themselves that because that's how they move, from one stage to another, basically. It's the materialist, reductionist, that hardcore view of the world that has brought us to where we are now. This is more or less a direct result of it. Yeah. And we talked about the increasing fundamentalism going on in the world. Well, there's fundamentalism coming from all sides, including scientific fundamentalism. Yeah. And it's basically, if we use fundamentalism not as just as a religious or pseudo-religious term, but just as in all modes of thought, people are becoming more atomized and divided. Just, as science tells us things are. And I think that this denial of meaning and purpose in individual lives and collectively is bound to leave the sort of the wreckage that we see building up around us. However, in your book, when you're talking about the sort of re-emergence of certain forces and reattraction to certain things, and updating of traditions from the past in a modern context, magic through to chaos magic, for example, being a good example of this sort of updating. That perhaps represents a move that may show us a way out of this kind of dead end, this cul-de-sac that we're kind of in at the minute. And of course, a lot of people want to deny that's possible, but that's something that is a development in collective consciousness, in human culture that is real. You've documented it in the book. And for me, that's a source of great optimism. I know some people view the idea of a returning era of myth and magic with just horror. But that quite often comes from just thinking about what the past has been like and thinking that the past has always got to be worse than the present, which is not the case, I would argue very strongly now. But also just literally what the words myth and what the words magic, for example, mean to people. And they just think of like insubstantial, untruth, wishful thinking, not reality based. And as I say, we're finding maybe just at the right time that the latest science is beginning to show us how these things what the mechanics of this could be.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And that environment is, it must be, not problematic, but it must be kind of strange to be in that environment because, we don't really, I don't have full insight into it, but when I read, pop renditions of it, like for instance in Scientific American or these magazines who try to explain these very abstracted concepts to normal readers, it's so fascinating and so psychedelic and so magical in a way too. But it must be very problematic to be inside that environment too and have these groundbreaking ideas and yet perhaps not be able to fully, disclose what you're working on because you're afraid that someone will steal your idea. That's true of all intellectual environments. Or it could be that, they're afraid of not getting funding for research because there's no obvious financial gain at the end of the tunnel. Because people who are doing these extremely advanced quantum physics, experiment, what's it going to be used for? You can speculate about, space and outer space and other planets and involve astronomy in that. And then, parallel universes and the bending of energy and all these things. How is it going to be exploited? So this is all based on the fact that there are still, environments of universities who just want to take the work further without financial gain. Now that's an increasing problem when it comes to a monoculture that we live in that is increasingly corporate, meaning that there has to be financial gain at the end of the tunnel. So I'm sure there are a lot of problematic issues in the so-called scientific environment. And then again, it's probably such a big environment that you can't, even call it one environment. But, the difference being people who work with biology, for instance, or chemistry, they can get funding because at the end of the day or the process, there will be some kind of medication or agent that can be exploited for spraying or genetic engineering and stuff like that. That is equally mind-bending, equally, science fiction based in a way. But they have already found ways of exploiting that. But the hardcore physics stuff, if you talk to, I hate the word normal, but if you talk to a normal person, a Western person who's sort of educated and fairly enlightened, probably secular, and ask them to explain Einstein's theory of relativity, they probably can't. And yet, that's one of the fundaments of these past 100 years. I don't know exactly when he developed it, but it was surely 100 years ago. And yet, it's still so abstracted. And during these 100 years, even more fantastic things have been discovered, both, on a theoretical, but also on a practical level, practical, physical, tangible level. And it's remarkable, because that is, from my point of view, where the real magic lies, so to speak. So maybe there needs to be a merging of a mythic force with the current, actually technology, but also the sciences, but one that is filled with the hope of something super constructive happening. You take all of these extremely abstracted ideas and theories and weave them into something that touches the human soul. Because when when I think of technology today, I think only of dystopia. I think only about the imminence, end times, brutal takeover by technology, solar flares, destroying all of human memories that are stored on digital media, etc., etc. It's all dystopian. But what if the scientists somehow, I'm not asking them to clothe their findings or the speculations in some kind of literary or fictional form or poetic form. I think that's beyond them. They are honed and trimmed and trained to think in a different way. But if that kind of poetic approach to these extremely interesting things and concepts, if that could merge, then I think we could come up with myths that would truly affect people.
Yeah, the implications of quantum physics just simply haven't been integrated into science, not only into science, but culture in general as well. And of course, there's been a lot of speculation about the implications of quantum physics that have veered off track. And there's been certain people, lots of popular books have been written that actually don't reflect reality or don't really reflect possibilities. They're exaggerating. So that clouds the situation a great deal. But I think that what it is telling us is basically pointing to something that has been understood for human history as far back as we can see, and probably beyond. Insights about the fundamental nature of reality and what this is all about, what is happening. It may be very far from the core of any truth, if such a thing is reachable, but it's still telling us something really, really important. I've referred to CERN and the work they're doing there with the Large Hadron Collider. All of that is the largest cathedral in the world. Because those people are gripped by a quest for a fundamental reality or something deeper than what we currently understand. And it's very religious, really, at the end of the day. And that's ultimately people who are questing, it's certainly what I'm doing personally, is trying to figure out what is this for? What are we part of? What are we?
Exactly.
The big question is, why are we here? Where do we come from? Where are we going? And it's, anybody who's not asking those questions, really, it's strange. We seem to be driven to ask those questions, a lot of us, or even the people who deny them, they're still denying an urge. It's still there, and that can be the source of a lot of dissatisfaction, really, with life in general, because they're not asking those questions of themselves or of the wider reality.
No, but that's the essence. That's the function of the myth too, to ask those questions, but to ask it in an accessible form. And that's the problem again with, the CERN people or quantum physics people. They are as arcane and as esoteric as magicians ever were. And, in the book I write about this thing where, you could possibly exchange the arcane terminology for something more artistic or, lightweight or accessible. And I think that would be very interesting for people to apply these, ideas and rituals and stuff like that. But, see it more as a generally creative process. And if these people who are dealing with this advanced physics stuff could learn to clothe their things, and you mentioned CERN as a cathedral, and I agree. But if they could just communicate, that's the issue. If they could communicate what they're finding, and of course why they're doing this work and who is funding it and why, because the criticism, I think I once raised that criticism myself, is that are they just trying to replicate the Big Bang, then why? That's another dystopian possibility, because if they want to be able to see what it is so that they can replicate it, that's surely a space travel thing. How do you create instant new life in a way in a distant galaxy that would fit human, life requirements? So that's the thing where you spend billions and billions of dollars on something that people don't understand. That in itself creates a bit of unease on unconscious levels.
Oh yeah, and scientists are often quite bad at communicating with the public. They can also be
indeed
patronizing and condescending. But there is a risk here as well, because I don't think either of us is anti-scientific. In fact, what we're probably saying here in general terms is that magic, science, there are mechanisms, but how reality comes into being and how it can be altered. These things are not mutually exclusive. That's what we're actually saying. But there is a danger.
Yes.
There's a danger here of some kind of like backlash. We have the ideas of people, like Luddite idea, like technology is going in a certain direction. They don't like it, so they want to smash the machines.
Yeah.
Throwing out the baby with the bathwater, the good goes with the bad. And of course, good and bad are all a matter of perception. But we already have a situation where people are quite resentful about scientific projects being funded when they see poverty on their own doorstep, for example. There's lots of places that money gets funneled, that doesn't appear to have any immediate benefit or any prospect of benefit for the species any time in the future. And of course, some things are just interesting in their own right. Not everything has to have a point, and certainly not everything need to have a commercial purpose. But I just see an anti-scientific backlash as a risk, I think, going for, not maybe so much right now, but you look at, for example, the way thinking's changing in the US. It does seem to be regressing somewhat. Certainly the progressive, look at the reaction from so-called progressive politicians and progressive voters in the US to Trump's election. They just can't, they cannot believe what is happening. The real tangible sense that it's going backwards.
Yeah. No, and also I think it's very much tied in with, as you say, it's a Luddite way of thinking, because it's so tied in not only with a private use of evangelical Christianity, but an overt, blatant, unashamed evangelical Christianity, saying that, there's a complete disrespect for other people, other religions, that has been made obvious in the new kinds of attempts at legislation and things like that. So it's just remarkable how audacious these retrograde forces are, in the sense that, maybe 50 years ago they were sort of keeping it to themselves and affecting things more on a lobbying level. But now that they've acquired some kind of foothold, it's just blatant. If I were a Christian, I would say that the current administration is totally the Antichrist, in that sense.
Oh, and there are people who said, for example, this is just one possible scenario, who have said, if working nuclear weapons or even nuclear weapons grade material were ever to fall into the hands of Islamic terrorists, they would use it. And I don't doubt for a second that there are individuals, and probably more like collectives, let's face it, in the world, organizations, groups, or a certain mindset that if they were able to flick a switch and, nuke the world, they would do it. For who knows what reasons, there'd be all sorts of reasons, but they would do it. We're that close. And I think that as appalled as people are by Trump, in a way, I'm looking for, when I say I'm looking for the positive here, that sounds laughable, but I'm talking about collectively as a species, he's a disruptor. And I think more of the same. We've had more of the same and more of the same and more of the same. And Trump, basically Trump could have been avoided if people had done things differently in the past, but he became inevitable. Trump was a disruptor, a spanner thrown into the works. Just get used to it. He's here. He won't be here forever, but he and some of his people are here now. They're disrupting things. It is what it is. Stop looking for answers from outside. Stop listening to these people. Put your own house in order, as they say, first. And don't feel, these global changes, these chaotic changes are increasing. You mentioned earlier the idea of time moving faster. Things seem to be accelerating. This is going to continue whether you like it or not. And whether I like it or not, whether you, Carl, like it or not, whether anybody listening likes it or not. So use it. Work with it. Don't make your own life, meaning and purpose dependent on this stuff that's happening.
No, exactly. And that's the thing, sort of, it has such a tendency to steal the attention and decrease the attention span even further. And that's the real negative effect of it. So I can only, concur and say that, turn off the machine in a way and don't listen to it.
As we draw things to a close today, Carl, our talk has been inspired by your latest book. That's Occulture, the unseen forces that drive culture forward. We've really only touched on a few dimensions of the topics that you get into in the book. I mean, there's lots of other things we could have talked about. You've got a chapter talking about Anton LaVey, the notorious, founder of the Church of Satan, Aleister Crowley, who we mentioned. There was a very interesting chapter I really enjoyed about the moon and what role that plays in our consciousness and in our culture. So there's all sorts. There's a very interesting collection of essays and talks that you've put together here. Now that's widely available everywhere. People have no trouble finding that online. Just before we finish off, tell listeners about your website, anything that you're working on, anything else you want to put out there.
Yeah, thank you. I think me and my wife are doing a lot of things together, basically artistic expressions, but it's filled with a lot of magical theory and thereby also practice. And we have a Patreon page where we try to really go in depth about these processes that we're involved in. So that would be one, patreon.com/Vanessa23Carl. Vanessa23Carl. That's one. And then there's my website, carlabrahamsson.com, in which I write about things, and there's news, and you have the newsletter there that you can sign up for, and that's basically it. Those two cover most of it. Then I have a lot of other things, like a little music label called Highbrow Lowlife, and the book publishing company which is called Trap Art, and it's just a steady flow of cultural lava coming from this little volcano in Stockholm, and I encourage correspondence and communication. So if people want to write in, that's a great way to do it, and that would be via carlabrahamsson.com, and I encourage that. And on the whole, I think there is a steady stream of things coming up, and both me and my wife were working on new books, new writing projects, and it's just a very great thing. And I have to say also that the fact that Occulture comes out, it's great, of course, great for me, but I think it also coincides beautifully with a greater openness for these things. There's right now an exhibition in Barcelona called Black Light that just opened at a big art place, and it's about occulture, about magic and occult things in art. And it's not the first one. They had the Venice Biennale a couple of years ago that was steeped in magic, and 10 years ago I went to see the Traces of the Sacred exhibition at the Pompidou in Paris. So this past decade has just been like an increase of getting people aware of the fact that there is a strong correspondence between these two fields of activity. And, I've been asked to teach about occulture specifically, historically or, theoretically in various parts of the world. So things are definitely going on. And I'm very happy about that, not only from the point of view of being able to network and find some kind of sustenance in this, but on the greater level also to see that some parts of the world seem to be waking up to the fact that there's more to this than just some kind of Harry Potter fantasy.
Splendid. Well, Carl, thank you so much for joining us today on LegalizeFreedom.com.
Great. Thank you, Greg. It was nice. Thank you.